Hey guys, I have no idea what to title this video. We're gonna be talking a little bit about poverty, but also historical moments of crisis, kind of sort of around extremist groups, but not entirely. I don't know. I try to theme these, but my own reading isn't themed, so sometimes when I come up to these, I don't even know what to do anymore. But anyway, we will end with this super awesome discussion of poverty because I actually think those are my two favorite books in this list. So we will start with the less fun issue of radicals and extremist groups and otherwise just not great fun times to live through. I'm just going to talk about these in the order that I read them because it's simpler. So I'm going to start with Birchers, How the John Birch Society Radicalized the American Right by Matthew Dallek. I originally requested this book because there was a lot of just discussion of the John Birch Society in just general politics, discussion and rhetoric and all that kind of stuff, and people saying that oh, this is a harkening back to the John Birch Society or stuff like that. And so I was like, okay, well, I only know the basics about the John Birch Society and I am not quite sure how people are relating this previous organization to today, or if they're saying it's still alive or what's going on. So this is a fairly new book, and so I thought it would be very useful. I did find the first half to 2/3 of it to be really, really useful. Dallek had access to the John Birch Society archives, everything that is left, and he had letters and first-person accounts and all that kind of stuff, and it really, really did a good job setting up how the first version of the John Birch Society was built and their aims, and then how this originally basically secret society of a few group of white men basically turned the thing into a nationwide, had cells and leaners, and women got really involved, and it was just it went from literally a secret meeting in a living room to a national organization. And that was definitely really interesting, if also a little bit frightening, on how fast and powerful they were able to grow the organization. However, the whole part where he starts to transition out of when, because as many organizations do, the John Birch Society reached a peak and then started to fall off and then basically fell out of favor because their ideas, even for the right, were too radical for a while. And then the whole rest of the book, the last third, is how all of these ideas are applied in Republican politics now and how it directly relates back to the Birch Society. And that argument is definitely weaker, just in the sense that sometimes ideas are ideas, and Dallek continuously saying, and you can trace this right back to the Birch Society and this right back to the Birch Society. I just didn't feel that evidence was there. And so while I agree that, these ideas from the Birch Society, a lot of them have come back up in Republican politics, or they've been refashioned, or they sound similar, ideas on all sides of the aisle also seem very cyclical. So there's always this push and pull in how radical or conservative the different parties are, and especially in reactionary things. So I just kind of felt him saying, oh, it all leads back to the Birch Society, kind of undercut some of the new things that some of the reactionary politics are responding to. And I was just not a fan. I don't think the argument is totally there. So I certainly would not dissuade anyone from reading it, but I will say that the history of the original John Birch Society is really, really good. And then I think I would take the rest of it with a little bit of a grain of salt. So next we're gonna go back even further to another group of extremisms, to Klan War, Ulysses S. Grant and the Battle to Save Reconstruction by Fergus Bordowich. I felt very tentative about this book in the beginning because any book that just comes out really strongly and is rah, a very specific person, I'm oh, okay. that's a little like hero worshipy. And I felt like Bordewich came out really, really strongly in favor of Grant in the beginning of this book. And while I will not argue that Grant did way more for Reconstruction than, say, Andrew Johnson, Grant also had a problematic presidency in other ways, like via corruption. And so the entire like, rah, Grant was great. I was like, ugh, if that's how the rest of this book is gonna go, and it's really gonna be focused on how like Grant did everything, which again, I know is in the subtitle and he's on the front cover of the book, but I was like, is this gonna get to more nuance, or is this just gonna be like a one-person story? I'm really, really glad that I hung with it, because after you kind of get past that point, the book gets really, really good and involved, and it's still rah Grant, but it really is focused on the stories of Reconstruction era heroes and who like stood up to people who really, really wanted to bring Reconstruction down, like on the local level, rather than just Grant or Grant's administration. It was really focused on telling you stories from the community level, the personal level, and how individuals or communities stood up to people trying to undo the gains of the Civil War, that particularly for African Americans. Obviously, because of that, there is also a lot of descriptions of violence from the KKK, and that factors very heavily into why many of these communities stand up for themselves or have to fight back, because there is all of this violence and murder and pain going on. And that is described in detail in this book as well. And so while I don't think anyone would go into a book on Reconstruction or the KKK without thinking that that would be there, I definitely do want to say it is there, and you have to be ready for some really hard pages because this history is really hard. In the end, even though this book has Grant on the cover and Grant's first name in the subtitle, even the epilogue of the book really seems to nod to the fact that these like smaller players that you may never have heard about before probably had on the local level far more impact than Grant did to save Reconstruction as much as they could, because the epilogue even finishes off with like how these people's lives went on after the stories that are told in the book. And while I don't always really enjoy that as an epilogue, because I'm just like, why are we getting all these little mini stories? I appreciated it in this book because I think it really drives home in the end that Grant might have been the president, but these people were the ones on the ground doing the work. And not that being president in this time wasn't difficult, but you know, they were doing it at the point of violence. So it's a really hard time, really hard history, but I, in the end, enjoyed the book much more than I thought I would when I started. So skipping forward a little bit, we have In the Shadow of Fear, America and the World in 1950 by Nick Bunker. This book is particularly interesting because it takes a close-up view of 1 year of history. So this is like the tail end of 1949 into 1950. This is a very, very tumultuous time in American history, but also the world. This is where the Truman administration is trying to deal with bringing all of the GIs home and how America looks when it is not at war, which it had been now for some time, how to kind of reconfigure the economy, right? You have a lot of women who had taken over jobs while men were at war, and now the men are coming home, they need an education, they want their jobs back. And there are lots of laborers who are either, you know, servicemen who are coming back, or they've been doing these jobs the entire war. And because of the war, they haven't really seen a pay increase. So there's lots of labor unrest here. And there's just a lot of political turmoil about what's the best way to kind of like utilize America's new superpower status and the beginning of the Cold War. And needless to say, also across the world, you have things like Maoist China coming to the rise and the beginnings of the issues that will become the Korean War. There's a lot happening, and a book like this that really slows down that 1 year kind of gives you a much more comprehensive view on the day-to-day state of affairs and how things progressed. I thought it was really, really well written. It's not a period of history I'm particularly interested in, so I wouldn't say I was like grabbed by it. But if this kind of like, you know, the turning points of history where nothing really, one big thing isn't really happening, but a lot of little things that make big things are happening or setting up for the next set of major world events, it's really, really well written. And so you might be interested in that. So now on to poverty. Yay. I read 2 books basically back to back, and I'm just going to talk about them in the order that I read them. And one is Poverty by America by Matthew Desmond. I have talked about this book before because it ended up being one of my best books of last year, and I completely did not expect it. This book is under 300 pages. It had gotten a lot of hype, and so I was like, it's really, really short. It's gotten a lot of hype. Like, it's not going to have the level of detail that I want it to have, and I probably won't enjoy it. But it was one of those, like, everyone can get a copy if they want to at my local library, and I was in between books and waiting for some holds to come in, so I said, sure, why not? This book is incredible. It is very statistic based, and Matthew Desmond, who also wrote a book called Evicted, for which he also won some major awards, has been writing about this for a really, really long time. And what I deeply appreciated was his ability to cut right to the heart of the matter in a very concise way that is very statistic driven. And he will say, like, this is the argument of the Republicans, this is the argument of the Democrats, but like, here are the numbers, and here's what we should do to address the numbers, not from a political standpoint, just like, this is the history of the numbers, this is the history of what's been tried, and these are the things that we have to fix. I highly also recommend listening to the audiobook, which is what I did, because it really feels like the narrator has such a strong presence that you're listening to a multi-hour like TED Talk or something, and I was just really, really invested the entire time. And again, it's also really hard to do an effective audiobook that is so focused on statistics and numbers, and it just has this really great line of being very concise. It never says more than it needs to. Of course, did I think it could say more in parts? Sure, that's not this book's project. It's very personal, it's very numbers driven. It was just really, really good. I really enjoyed it. And so if you have not yet read it because you were unsure about the hype, or if you would be interested, it is, for a nonfiction book, a fairly quick read, and just, I think, really, really worth it. So to follow that up, I also listened to The Injustice of Place, Uncovering the Legacy of Poverty in America. There's 3 authors, Kay Eden, H.L. Schaefer, and T. Nelson. This is I almost said narrativization, novelization. These are 3 researchers who did a multi-year long ethnographic project in which they used numbers to identify the places in America with the highest levels of poverty, and basically went there to try to figure out the historical reasons for why. And Matthew Desmond also says this in Poverty by America, but place matters. And he touches on this and he talks about it in like broad strokes. And so Injustice of Place was a great follow-up because the different chapters are their investigations of individual places and how these individual places, the history of the people who've lived there, the businesses that have come and gone, the ways that roads have been built and taken down, you know, the ways that farmland has been used or overused, or, you know, environmental stuff, have deeply, deeply affected a systemic problem of poverty in these places. And so while they're covering multiple places, you really do get a personal sense of the place and the people who are living here and how this has affected them. And it really just kind of does hit you in the face, I think, even more potentially than Poverty by America, in how poverty does become systemic. And the reason that it's systemic in a lot of these places is because of historically the ways that the place has been used and abused, and therefore the people in response to that have been used and abused. And obviously it also goes back to race and, you know, all of that kind of stuff, but there's a lot to be just read in the buildings and the land and its history. if you already read Poverty by America and are looking for another book to potentially like read after that, I highly recommend Injustice of Place. I will be doing ethnographic work for my dissertation, so I also really appreciated that as well. Again, they're more the researcher focus, where, you know, Matthew Desmond is kind of taking more of like a journalist approach, and so the tones are a little bit different, but I think they're a really, really good back-to-back read if it is an area of interest for you. So again, I know it's weird to say that I wanted to end this video on the high note of poverty. Poverty is not great, and both books make clear that America has a very, very systemic problem with it that needs a truly deep fix, that no quick fix is going to change. But I think both of these books do a really excellent job in highlighting the systemic nature of those issues. So they're definitely two of the books that I would most highly recommend from this list. But although if you want to read about the Birchers, the KKK, the 1950s, you know, there was some stuff here for you too. This is a wild ride as always, so thank you for hanging out with me, and I'll see you next time.